friend Helen Schuman, and she has had such an interesting life that I decided that I wanted to get together some of her stories and her wonderful experiences from her life. So thank you, Helen, for putting up with my little videography stuff and that we're going to kind of tell your story.
Okay.
So this is part one of the story. And so I thought we should probably start with your family and just, who you are and where you came from, because you kind of have an interesting family history.
That's for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was born in a little town. I think it's the last northern town of Utah called Tremont. And I was born in a little red brick hospital. And I was the fourth child and three girls. I made the third girl, and I had an older brother. And my father was basically a dry farmer, and he also had a dairy farm. And what's interesting about the Schumann family, Daddy's father and mother came over from Germany because they were converts to the church, and it was more comfortable. And they had just been between finished World War I, and things were really tight in Germany. And Grandpa had also heard about the Homestead Act and that property was available in northern Utah. So Grandpa and Grandma came over, and as soon as they got here, Grandpa contacted typhoid fever, and they think that he got it on the ship as they came over. And they came through Galveston, Texas, instead of Ellis Island. And it was pretty uncomfortable, apparently. And they had some difficulty getting on the train to get to Salt Lake. And they ended up getting to Salt Lake with only 60 cents in their pocket. And Grandma was just 6 weeks away from delivering Daddy. And Grandpa, being sick still, created a garden by the little house that they were living. And he was quite a gardener. And he and Maurice Warshaw sold produce along South Temple and together. And Grandma, after she was strong enough and Daddy was a little older, went along South Temple to beautiful mansions and cleaned homes. So they were very ambitious and worked hard. And Grandpa had found his way up to northern Utah to see what that country looked like. And it was just as barren as it is today, except that Grandpa bought enough acreage to eventually have 5 big dry farms. And he was instrumental in designing the first Columbine, which is amazing now because all the ranchers and farmers use Columbines. But that was before he knew about patents, unfortunately.
So he didn't get the patent. So he didn't make the millions off of a Columbine, but his idea was, he was the original idea person.
Exactly. Yes, wow. Exactly. And Grandpa always had the theory of working smarter rather than harder. And he was also quite, I would say, brilliant to a degree. And a story about Grandpa that's a bit of a tell with the family and interesting, but serves the point of which Grandpa would rather work smarter than harder. Daddy was never much of a dry farmer. He loved animals. And Grandpa, when he retired, gave each one of his children one of those dry farms. And Daddy took the money from the dry farm and bought the ranch in Nevada, in Clover Valley. And at the ranch, Daddy had to build some fences around some fields that he wanted to create a division for the cattle to eat, and also that they would get water, etc. So my Aunt Susie had just married my father's brother, youngest brother, George. And Grandpa decided that he needed Aunt Susie to help him hammer the nails into the posts. So he had Aunt Susie hold the nails while he hit them with the hammer. And every time, apparently, when he hit the nail with the hammer, Aunt Susie cringed. And this went on for, until about noon, I understand. And her nerves just got the better of her. And she said to Grandpa, "Hit your own damn finger," and she stomped off. And my grandfather was appalled that she first say that and then stomp off. Nobody did that to Grandpa. So Grandpa and Grandma loved the ranch too. They came out. I have fond memories of them coming to the ranch. And at first, there were two wonderful houses, old houses, but they weren't so old then. When we moved in, and we moved in the first house, and it was the older of the two homes. And Grandpa and Grandma didn't live in the big house, but when they came to visit, they would stay in the big house. And we always had relatives coming over. Mama's and Grandpa's and Daddy's family would come over, and all of us kids would have friends come over and sleep overnight, which they would get on the school bus with us and come out to the ranch with us and help us kids with the chores and eat dinner. And then we'd usually do schoolwork with our friends, go to bed and get up in the morning, do chores again, hurry like mad to get dressed and hop on the school bus again. But the school bus didn't come until later. We had it was literally red, that little red schoolhouse at the ranch. And the teacher stayed with us. And she stayed in the best room, of course. Mrs. Bishop was her name. And I have fond memories of the little red schoolhouse, in that I would help my father go to the schoolhouse first thing in the morning and put wood and coal in the little, it was kind of a pot belly stove that was in the center of the room. And we would get the fire started and get the room warmed up. And we had desks that you would lift the top up and down, and had little ink wells in it and little quill pens with it. And she was teaching grades from 1 to 8. And if you graduated from 8th grade, then you went on to high school, which was freshman through senior. And I always looked really forward to recess, because the kids would come out, and the schoolhouse was in one of the pastures, actually. And there was a creek that ran by. And winter, we used to have bitter winters. And I remember one winter, we created two teams, and we built kind of like igloos, but they were more like forts. And then we started throwing snowballs at each other. And then we got a little more clever and got our snowballs wet. So at night they froze, and they were really literally ammunition. You got hit by one of them and you were goners. And if I remember correctly, we had to stop doing that, the watering the snowballs down. And Mrs. Bishop would let me come in, and she had one little desk for me, and she taught me my ABCs and how to write, and also how to add. And so when I was able to go to first grade, which by then they had consolidated all of these little schools in all these different valleys around Wells. And first grade was the first grade that the school bus came. So I did get to enjoy the Little Red Schoolhouse for years, which was great, and fond memories about that. One thing about that little creek that I mentioned earlier, above the Little Red Schoolhouse was the chicken house and chicken run, and it was pretty big. And then above that were two bunkhouses, and across the creek was outhouse with two holes in it. So you could bring a companion there if you so desired.
A two-seater.
A two-seater, exactly. And the Sears Roebuck catalog, which you used for toilet paper after you were through thumbing through it. So after you were through thumbing through it, you were bumming through it.
There you go.
The fun story about that is across this meadow were a long barn, and in it had a number of different stalls. And in those stalls, my dad would put the show cattle in to dress them out and get them ready for the cattle shows. Well, the closest bathroom was this outhouse. So if anyone had to go to the bathroom, you had to quickly toddle across the pasture, past the bunkhouses, over the creek to the John. And Grandpa had to go to the bathroom one afternoon, as he always did. And Daddy had the herd bull in the pasture.
Oops.
And this bull decided that he needed his back scratched. So the closest available thing that fit his desire was this red outhouse. So the bull went over to that house and started scratching himself while my grandfather was sitting on one of the two-seaters. And he started yelling with a very German accent, "Kids, you stop that! Kids, stop doing that! I'm going to spank you!" And we heard Grandpa hollering, and we were over at the barns. We were looking at each other, we're all here. And we went out to see what in the world could Grandpa be shouting at, or who. And there was this bull just enjoying himself so much, not paying one bit of attention to Grandpa.
Yep.
So Grandpa had quite an experience because he was a big bull, and the outhouse was not anchored down by any concrete at all. It just had a wood base, and so it could rock. So you can get a clear picture of that. For sure. I love that old house that we lived in. I was 18 months old when we moved from Tremont to which was the closest town from the dry farms. And we only lived at the dry farms during the summer. And it was very rudimentary, is that the right word? It didn't have indoor plumbing, it didn't have water, it just basically was a 2-room shack, basically. And it got so hot, and the wind would blow. There were no trees there at all, and it was really barren except for this beautiful grain that my father and grandfather had planted. And it was beautiful when it started to sprout and turn this beautiful spring green. And then as it grew, it turned to a darker green, which was amazing to watch nature. Because when it started to get ripe and ready to cut, it would start turning to a beautiful golden. And when the wind would pick up, if the grain had a wonderful spring for the water, because that's the only time the grain would grow was in the spring, because it would rain a lot. And then there'd be no water. So it was critical to get that seed in the ground at the right time. Anyway, when the grain got tall enough and the wind started to blow, it looked just like the waves of an ocean. It was really beautiful to see how the grass or the grain would take its own action, uh, modulate over and over and over. It was so pretty to watch. But I must say, I'm awfully glad that Daddy sold that. That was a dirty, tough life. There's several interesting stories about that too that I'll relate. My father was on a mission in Germany just before the war broke out in 1936, 37. And I think he started the mission in 35. And of course, Hyrum was very successful missionary, and it was only one mission, the whole of Germany. And now apparently it's like 4 missions or something like that. Anyway, Daddy would get on the train and travel all over Germany, and he was on his own, literally. He had several companions, and they all became very good friends besides fellow missionaries. One story about that is that Daddy and his missionary companions didn't have much use to washing dishes. So they'd eat, lick the plates, and turn the plates over. Can you imagine?
No.
Well, they didn't want flies on them, so they turned the plate. During that time, though, Hitler was rising in power. And Daddy watched all of that coming on, and he warned what few Mormons there were in Germany at that time. And Daddy, given that he had to handle all of Germany, would only come to this beautiful little town called Celia once in a blue moon because he had the rest of the country to check out. Well, in Celia, he saw Miss Marlena Pohlsander, and she caught his eye, and she was 16, was just turning 16 when Daddy first saw her. And as he could read in his missionary journal, that every time he went to Celia, he kept an eye on little Marlena. And in one of his quotes, he said, Miss Marlena is getting to be quite the woman, and I like it very much. Yep. And Daddy was very proper. In fact, my mother caught him looking at her several times and knew that he had taken a liking to her, and she would never admit it, but she had a very sly way of flirting. So she made sure that big Helen Schuman kept his eye on her. And in fact, after he was released, they were released at the mission. And as soon as he got the word that he was released, he found himself in Celia, and he knocked on the Pohlsander door, who, by the way, were only 2 families in Celia that were Mormon. And Mama's family were the most ardent Mormons. And so the meetings were held at their house always. And so anyway, Daddy was knocking on their door, and he asked to talk to Brother Pohlsander. And as the story goes, everyone had an inkling about what he was up to. And Daddy and Opa, we called him Opa, went to his office space, and Daddy asked for permission to court little Marlena. And there was some discussion, but my grandfather was all for it. So Daddy stayed in Germany for 6 weeks courting Mama. And at first, they, of course, had to have chaperones. You know, that's what you had to do in those days. Anyway, before Daddy left, uh, little Marlena agreed that they could be engaged and that they would write letters. And Daddy saved every one of those letters, and Mama saved a lot of hers too. And they created a real love for each other. It was really a sweet, wonderful love. And they weren't too far into that year that they were separated that they decided that both of them would work really hard, and Daddy would come over in a year, marry her, and bring her to the States. Now, mind you, this was just before the war. In fact, Mama was the first non-Jew to get out of Germany in 9 months. And there were miracles that happened for her to get through. It was in who you knew and how much were they willing to get paid and all of that. It was really rather frightening. In fact, they didn't know for sure until Daddy got there, well, even while they were there, that he could bring her. It was just before the ship sailed, before they knew that she could come. It was really an iffy thing. But Daddy loved opera, so he would go to the theaters in Germany and listen to the operas. He was in the stadium when the black runner. Do you remember his name?
From the Olympics.
Yes, and he won the race.
Right.
And Hitler refused to give him the gold medal.
Right.
Oh, that's terrible. I can't remember. It's the morphine, you guys. It's the morphine. I'll remember down the road.
Exactly.
So Daddy, he took the advantage of seeing all of the lovely things that Germany had to offer. And he learned to speak German like a native. Well, in fact, he couldn't speak English until he was 8 years old because that's all that his family, his mother and father spoke. And also, they kept Daddy out of school during the springtime to get the grain in. And so Daddy hit and missed school all through school. And it's amazing that he graduated. But that also says that he was also quite smart and ambitious too. And where do I go from here, Suzanne?
So now she got on the boat and she made it. Now, did all of her family get out of Germany too? Or no? Right?
No, in fact, I remember they didn't come until they came in. The first batch came, well, the whole family except her next sister, because she was older than 18, and U.S. didn't take anyone, or not all the family could go if there was someone older than 18. And by the way, Mama was 18 when they got married. And they got married in the little castle in Celia. And that was another way to get Mama through. She had to be married to an American. And just as a little side note, they did take a trip to Paris because they got on the boat in Le Havre, France. And they went to Paris, and Grandpa, by the way, was with him. And
so Hyrum's father
right. Went with Daddy.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And he still had family there, Grandpa did. And Daddy had gone to his relatives to visit them and get to know them, even on his mission. So I understand that was quite a reunion, as you can imagine.
Oh, yeah.
It had been let's see, Daddy was 26. Yeah, Daddy was an older missionary because he had to stay to help with all this land. If you can
Right.
imagine, 5 farms,
Right.
of which Grandpa homesteaded every one of them. So that's an awful lot of land. Oh, another little story of Grandpa. He was always the first to have anything in Box Elder County. And he was the first to have a Model T. What came first, Model A or Model T?
I have no idea.
Ford.
Yeah, I have no idea.
One of those.
One of
the
those.
first
Okay.
one.
Okay.
Well, there was really a steep hill. Actually, it's more a mountain, but they called it a hill. In the East, they would have said it's a huge mountain. Well, it's steep, and it was called Rattlesnake Pass. Well, the Model AT couldn't quite make it. So everyone had to pile out of the AT, including Grandma, and push it up over the hill while Grandpa stayed in the car and drove it over the hill. Not Grandma, who was very capable of driving over the hill.
Right.
Had to be Grandpa.
Yeah. Yep.
There's the smarter rather than harder.
Yeah, exactly. So now, did your mother's family all get out of Germany before the war, or did they survive the war?
Oh, thank you for bringing me back.
You're good.
Yes. No, they didn't make it. And it had been 4 yethey before they really heard from the family. And it would be months and months even then before.
Wow.
And they did make it through. All of them made it through, but they had to be extremely careful. They had an apartment above a fellow in his home. He lived downstairs. And he was not a Mormon. And he also joined the Nazi party. Thank you. And the party, if you were a member of the party, you had to report who wasn't a member of the party. And the Mormons were suspicious anyway. Who the hell are Mormons?
Right.
And in fact, the story goes that my aunts and uncles had to stay in school with the Jewish children because the Nazis didn't know if they were like the Jews. In a way, the Mormons have an awful lot of similarities in terms of the religious beliefs, except they don't believe that Christ was the savior.
Right.
Just a good guy.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So,
Well,
when the bomb alerts came, the big sirens would ring. They'd run down to the basement, and the kids didn't dare breathe because they were so afraid someone was going to say something that would trigger the owner of the apartment to say, hey, so they were really, really on pins and needles all the time. There's another awful story too, that during the war, the Celia was not a strategic little town. So the Allies pretty much left it alone. But Hamburg was only 50 kilometers away, and so was Frankfurt. And so the planes would fly over, and the relatives, aunts and uncles, would say they heard the planes flying. They were always low, and it was frightening. Well, one squadron somehow got their directions mixed up, apparently, and they dropped a bomb on the railway station. And unfortunately, the train was headed to a concentration camp that was outside of Celia, and not one of the townspeople knew about this train or this concentration camp.
Wow.
Because apparently the trains would stop outside of the town and they would march the Jewish people or prisoners to this concentration camp.
Whoa.
Anyway, the train was coming through full of these prisoners, and the air squadron dropped a bomb onto the train. Ooh. And apparently everyone was killed. And food was really, really short in supply. It was terrible, in fact.
Yeah.
So my aunts and uncles, because my Oma was very resourceful, and but there were potatoes on the train. And so my uncle and Oma went to help gather the potatoes up. But in doing so, they were around body parts.
Oh, wow.
And my uncle still to this day has nightmares about that, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And then after the Allies came through, they, of course, opened the concentration camp, and these ghosts started appearing in Celia, and no one in the town could believe their eyes. Who are these people? And so many of them didn't speak German. They were Polish and Russian and from the Croatian countries. And so, but those who could would try to help them. And then the Allies came to gather up these people to try to help them get started. But yes, it was a tough time. And even during the war, when they couldn't get any mail through, after the war, it was still extremely difficult.
Oh, yeah.
And my grandmother, Oma, told me about times where she would see people literally with wheelbarrows full of money and only able to buy a loaf of bread.
Oh, wow.
Because their German money wasn't worth anything. Food was the thing that was something. And so it was a difficult time. But after the war, I remember helping Mama and Daddy pack big cardboard boxes full of thread, zippers, needles, all kinds of clothing, and candy bars, Hershey candy bars, and cigarettes. Now, this was talk of the little town in Wales. That the Schumann family are all of a sudden buying cartons of cigarettes and cartons of Jell-O. And so what we would do, Mama would do, us kids too, with our job to very carefully open the Jell-O box and also the little wax paper type packaging inside that. We would dump the Jell-O into a bowl way before these wonderful plastic sacks with zippers on them. And we would take the cigarettes and put them in these Jell-O boxes and very carefully reseal the wax paper so it would feel like Jell-O was in, and they never got stopped. But they used the chocolate and the cigarettes as barter, and that was like gold.
Wow.
They could get almost anything they wanted with an American cigarette. Wow. And they had to be so careful with who they bartered with. And but that's what saved their cookies, was that cigarette.
Wow.
And chocolate. And they had heard stories about how wealthy the Americans were. And so the letters back from Germany to my family, my mother, were not too kind. They wanted to know where were these wonderful nylons and all of, these different things that they heard, the makeup and things. Well, good heavens, everything went toward the war effort. And U.S. suffered. The civilians and residents of U.S. were having a difficult time too. Things were rationed, but somehow the Germans didn't get that. The German family, they only heard of incredible abundance. Heavens, money was growing on trees, and
Right.
all this property. If you had an acre, you were a farmer in Germany. But if you had thousands and thousands of acres, I mean, goodness, you were a land baron. Never mind that you had to work your butt off and all of that.
Yeah.
So
after the war, did they come to the U.S.? Did they all move?
Daddy and Mama and Daddy's family worked really hard to save enough money to get them over here. And they came about 4 years later, if I remember correctly.
After the war.
After the war. And Daddy and Mama really sacrificed to get them over here. And my grandfather, Opa, was a real stinker. Much more so than Grandpa. There was no comparison, actually. Opa had a real high appreciation of himself. Everyone was beneath him.
Okay.
And he was an accountant too. And the only way to get the family over here was that you had to guarantee that they had a place to live and that they had a job that would support the family. And there were several other requirements that I can't think of right now. Well, the only thing that Grandpa and Daddy had were the dry farms and the dairy farm. So when they came over, they had Opa work in the dairy farm. Can you believe him being a dairyman? Oh, it was just pure hell.
Oh,
and so ungrateful. And Oma and the siblings were, of course, very grateful to be over there. And Opa turned to be a really bitter man. In fact, so bitter that he actually was dangerous. I can remember somehow, and I don't know exactly the story because there was a lot of animosity, and I was only about 2 years old when they came over, not quite 2 years old, but somehow, I don't remember how, Opa made such a big noise that Daddy and Mama somehow bought a little chicken farm out here in Salt Lake, actually out by Murray. And he thought that he could do that. And I can remember by then we had bought the ranch, and my older sister Venna and I came in to visit the family. And I can remember real clearly, Opa and one of his boys, one of my uncles, were sitting out front and they were peeling something. They both had knives, and Venna and I were doing something, and nothing bad, but he didn't want to have us around, and he threatened us with those knives. And so, of course, that wasn't to be had, And so my grandmother, Oma, divorced him. And it was a terrible brouhaha. I can remember in the middle of the night, the phone ringing and Daddy and Mama waking us kids up and grabbing what few clothes and rushing to Salt Lake City. And I can remember in the middle of the night passing the Kennecott smelter, and the waste would look just like lava coming out of a volcano. It was awesome to watch in the middle of the night. It was spooky, and Daddy and Mama spoke only German because they didn't want us kids to know the craziness that was going on in Salt Lake. And we didn't know for sure, but we knew we weren't to say anything, especially when we came to Salt Lake.
Right.
We were to be good kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Mom and Daddy worked really hard for her family, and most of the time it was not appreciated.
Wow.
At least with Opa, I
Yeah.
should say, but Oma and her aunts and her siblings definitely did.
Wow.
And they helped put Ingrid through nursing school when they finally, she was the last one to come. And that's a story. It was, what did they call that when the bride never saw the husband? Oh, it was like a mail order bride thing.
Wow.
There was two old bachelors up in northern Utah, and Mama and Daddy somehow coerced one of these bachelors to marry poor Ingrid, sight unseen.
Oh, whoa.
And she agreed. He apparently was decent enough looking and had a lovely farm, apparently, and they were doing well enough. So Ingrid lived with him only 6 months, I think, and said, "This is pure hell.
Oh, dear.
I'm out of here."
Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Mm-hmm.
All she ended up to be was the housekeeper and the cook, and she was a horrible cook.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear.
Good, marvelous housekeeper, but a terrible cook. And those boys had no idea on how to take care of a woman, much less a wife.
Oh,
I guess it was just horrible for poor Ingrid.
Oh, gosh.
And that's the time when she started studying, and she did very, very well. She was a surgeon's nurse, or surgery nurse, which is only the very best get in there and do that. And she loved nursing. She really did well. And Ingrid had kind of a tough life. Her father always told her that she wasn't one of his, because she didn't really look like anybody else. She had reddish hair and freckles all over the place. And apparently that was just not the thing to have in northern Germany.
Mm.
So he never claimed her. And my mother was always, I used to remember the name translation, but it meant little dolly or little doll.
Mm.
And Mama was called that all the time. And she was a beautiful woman, a beautiful little girl and woman. She grew up to be very pretty and took care of herself and had excellent taste and it all. So, okay, where are we? I'm getting lost.
So, well, that kind of, does that take us kind of through the war and getting the whole family kind of over here and everything? Does that?
Yeah, that pretty much tells it.
Yeah.
It was very difficult, and it took a long time because there were only prop airplanes then.
Right.
And, you know, they landed in New York and stayed in the airport until the next plane came through, and it took forever to fly anywhere, and so they were exhausted. And and then when they landed, they were expecting palaces and
oh my gosh. And they're in the country.
Shoveling cow shit out of the milk barn.
Exactly. Good. Okay, well, we'll take a little pause and then we'll continue on with Helen Schumann stories.
Okay. That's fun, honey.